Shoot for the tie. Pass will go to Kareem. Kareem's got the foul, and it's tied.
For more than a decade, the most openly joyful man in American sports. The smile came first, before the pass, before the fast break, before the scoreboard had a chance to explain what was happening. But there was a day when that same smile would not be enough. On November 7th, 1991, that man stood at a podium at the Great Western Forum and delivered news that no smile could soften. At 65, Irvin Johnson Jr. no longer belongs only to the Showtime Lakers, to the 5 championship banners, to the highlight reels that still circulate on television. Behind the grin was a harder truth, one the cameras never quite managed to catch. He was a boy in Lansing, Michigan, who learned early how to make the people around him better, before anyone, including Johnson himself, had a word for what that gift would eventually cost him. What follows is not only the record of what he won, it is the record of what all of it required. And it begins in a city most people only ever knew from the cars it built. Lansing, Michigan, in the 1960s, moved to the rhythm of Oldsmobile shift changes. It was a city built around the automobile industry, a place where a man's worth was often measured by what he built with his hands across an 8-hour shift, and where the sound of a factory whistle carried more authority than almost anything else in the neighborhood. Into that rhythm, a 6th child arrived who would eventually make the entire country stop and watch him instead. Irvin Johnson Jr. was born there on August 14, 1959, the 6th of 10 children in a household that ran on discipline because it had no other choice. His father, Irvin Johnson Sr., worked a full-time position at a General Motors fabrication plant and took on part-time garbage collection on top of it, stacking one job atop another because 10 children required more than a single paycheck could provide. His mother, Christine Johnson, worked in a school cafeteria and anchored the family through a deep and steady religious faith. What that home lacked in space, it made up for in something else entirely. 10 children in one household is not a detail to romanticize. It meant shared beds, shared chores, and a rotation of responsibility that started young. It also meant a father who, however exhausted, still found time to teach his son the game he loved, using it as one of the only luxuries a working family in Lansing could actually afford: a basketball and a hoop. What happened next on those same courts is the reason this story is being told at all. The courts on Middle Street became the container for whatever it was that Irvin Johnson Jr. was carrying inside him. There, he found something the rest of his day did not offer: control, structure, and a sense of order that his crowded household and demanding school schedule could not always provide. He has said of his parents, plainly and without embellishment, "God blessed me with 2 unbelievable parents, and I am just like both of them." That was not a performer's line. It was an accounting of where the discipline came from: his father's work ethic, his mother's steadiness, both showing up in a boy who had not yet been given a public name for what he was becoming. Lansing did not hand him an easy dream. It gave him one habit. When there was no language yet for what he felt, he went and found the court, and there, at least for a few hours, the world made sense on his terms. But the world outside that court was never quite so forgiving. The economics of that household were plain and unsentimental. 10 children moving through one set of rooms meant that privacy was a luxury almost nobody in that family could claim, and that responsibility arrived early and stayed. Irvin Johnson Sr. worked his GM shift and then went out afterward to collect garbage, stacking labor on top of labor, because a single income, however steady, could not stretch across 10 mouths and 10 sets of school clothes. What he passed on to his son in those hours was not leisure. It was a model of what a man does with the hours he is given, whether or not those hours are convenient. Basketball, in that household, was never framed as an escape from work. It was simply understood as another form of it, one that happened to bring the boy joy in the doing. And one adult outside that household was already watching closely enough to notice something the rest of the city had not yet seen. Dr. Charles Tucker, a family friend and psychologist, entered Johnson's life during these years and remained a steady presence for decades afterward. One of the earliest adults outside the household to recognize that what Johnson possessed was not only athletic, it was also a particular way of reading people, of understanding a room before he had fully understood himself. The place formed him before the world had a name for what it had formed. That name was coming soon, and it would arrive in a single high school game nobody in Lansing would ever forget. That structure met its first real stage at Everett High School, where Johnson played for Coach George Fox, a man who worked to develop both his game and his sense of discipline as an adolescent still growing into an unusual body. It was during his sophomore year, in a game against Parkside High School, that Johnson recorded a triple-double, most often cited as 36 points, 18 rebounds, and 16 assists. One sports writer in the stands that night would decide the boy needed a new name entirely. Fred Stabley Jr., a sports writer for the Lansing State Journal, watched that performance and gave the boy a nickname that would outlive nearly everything else about him: Magic. It was a gift and a demand delivered in the same word. The nickname announced an identity to the public before Johnson had fully built one for himself, and for the rest of his life, he would draw a careful distinction between the two. "Magic is who I am on the basketball court," he later said. "Irvin is who I am." What made the label fit, beyond the box score, was something no coach had taught him and no drill could manufacture. A 6'9" teenager who could handle a basketball with a guard's touch, who read the floor the way a chess player reads several moves ahead, and who delivered a pass with the geometry of someone who understood angles before he had mastered algebra. The court did not ask him to shrink to fit a position, it gave his size and his intelligence a single purpose. But success arriving early can become its own form of weight. Praise, when it comes before a young person has lived an ordinary life, can quietly turn into pressure disguised as admiration. By his senior year, Johnson had led Everett High School to the Michigan Class A state championship, a run built on the same court vision that had first earned him his nickname, now sharpened by 3 additional years of coaching under George Fox. What came next was a decision that would shape the rest of his career before he had even played a single college game. Recruiters from across the country made the trip to Lansing, and Johnson could have chosen almost any program willing to build itself around a 6'9" point guard. He chose to stay close to home, and the choice came down to 2 in-state rivals, Michigan and Michigan State. It was Judd Heathcote's willingness to let him play the point rather than push him toward a more conventional forward's role because of his height that ultimately decided it. That single conversation would carry him all the way to a night in Salt Lake City that changed college basketball forever. Michigan State University and coach Judd Heathcote became the bridge from Lansing to the national stage. Heathcote later said of him, "Without exaggeration, Irvin Johnson is the best player in the open court in all of basketball. Professional, international, intercollegiate." On March 26, 1979, Michigan State defeated Indiana State 75-64 in the NCAA championship game, a contest that remains, decades later, the most watched college basketball broadcast in American television history. Johnson scored 24 points, grabbed 7 rebounds, and handed out 5 assists that night. Watching from the other bench was a forward from Indiana State named Larry Bird, and the 2 young men who had just met on the biggest stage college basketball could offer would spend the next decade defining professional basketball together. That night in Salt Lake City did not create a rivalry so much as it opened a door. What waited on the other side of it was a league that badly needed both of them, and a test, 5 years later, that neither man's talent alone could answer. The first great public test came 5 years into his professional career, in the 1984 NBA Finals against the Boston Celtics, a series the Lakers lost in 7 games. Johnson was singled out for critical turnovers late in Game 4 that helped force overtime, and for stretches of uncharacteristic uncertainty in the final 2 contests. The newspapers found a phrase for it, and the phrase was cruel in a way that only a well-aimed pun can be: Tragic Johnson. For a player whose entire public identity had been built around elevating the men around him, the label struck at something more personal than a box score. A point guard can usually answer doubt with an assist, with a pass that proves the doubt wrong in real time. Here, the doubt was about him specifically, and no pass, however perfectly placed, could resolve a question about his own nerve. What made the label sting further was the timing of it. Johnson had entered that series as the presumptive best player alive, a young champion facing the one rival whose reputation for coldness under pressure had never once cracked. Boston did not need to invent a narrative. The Celtics simply waited for the Lakers' own turnovers and hesitations to write it for them. What the loss did not do was break him. Years later, With the clarity that only distance provides, Johnson said, "Losing to Boston in '84 was the best thing that ever happened to me." What came after that season was not the same young man who had entered it. Something harder, more exacting, had taken up residence alongside the joy, and it was about to meet a coach who demanded exactly that. The door that reopened for him arrived through two men who offered structure rather than comfort. Dr. Jerry Buss, the Lakers owner, had selected Johnson with the first overall pick in the 1979 draft and built an entire system, known to the public as Showtime, around the idea that a basketball game could also be a form of theater. Fast breaks, tempo. The Forum in Inglewood transformed into something closer to a nightly performance than a sporting event. But a vision needs discipline to survive contact with a long season, and that discipline arrived in 1981 with Pat Riley, promoted mid-season to head coach. Riley did not offer softness, and he did not promise that the basketball world would simply forget 1984. He offered a structure demanding enough that talent alone could no longer be the excuse. And structure alone would not be enough either. It would require sharing the floor with a man who had already been a superstar for a decade. Alongside this arrived one of the more delicate professional relationships in the sport's history, the pairing of a young point guard with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, already an established superstar by the time Johnson arrived. It required both men to surrender something. Abdul-Jabbar, a measure of the offense built around him for years. Johnson, the easy assumption that talent alone earns command of a locker room. Neither man diminished the other. Both became larger because of it. The proof of exactly how much larger arrived faster than anyone expected. The clearest proof of what that partnership could produce arrived almost immediately. In Game 6 of the 1980 NBA Finals, with Abdul-Jabbar sidelined by injury, a 20-year-old rookie started at center. Johnson scored 42 points, pulled down 15 rebounds, dished out 7 assists, and over the course of the evening played all 5 positions on the floor. The Lakers won the championship. Johnson was named Finals MVP, the first rookie in NBA history to receive that honor. The signature of that performance, and of the decade that followed, was a pass that had never quite existed in that form before him. The no-look pass, delivered to a location on the floor before the intended receiver had physically arrived there. It was not a reaction to what the defense was doing. It was a prediction of what a teammate was about to do, offered with total confidence before the fact. Understood correctly, that pass was never only a piece of technique. It was an argument, repeated hundreds of times across a career, that dominance could be generous, that greatness could lift the people around it rather than diminish them by comparison. "Assists is what Irvin is all about," Johnson said of himself. "That's what my whole life has been, assisting others." But even a gift this generous carried a cost few people bothered to notice. The cost of that particular gift was subtler than a losing season. Some analysts, watching a player who so plainly enjoyed making others look good, quietly filed him under facilitator rather than competitor, as though generosity and dominance could not occupy the same body. The smile that accompanied the pass, genuine every time it appeared, became evidence used against him in that same argument. Proof, to some, that he belonged to entertainment rather than to the harder category of competition. What that argument left out was everything happening underneath the highlight reel. The years that followed brought 5 NBA championships in total: 1980, 1982, 1985, 1987, and 1988, along with 3 NBA Most Valuable Player awards in 1987, 1989, and 1990, and 3 NBA Finals MVP honors in 1980, 1982, and 1987. The Forum in those years had a sound to it before it had a look, the low rumble of a sold-out crowd anticipating a fast break before it had even started, the particular roar reserved for a no-look pass rather than a made basket, as though the crowd understood it was watching a different kind of achievement unfold in real time. Celebrities filled the courtside seats, and the games themselves took on the rhythm of an event rather than simply a contest. Yet underneath the theater of it, 12 grueling professional seasons were still being played out on a body that had to answer for every one of them. And no rivalry defined those seasons more than the one waiting on the opposite bench. At the center of that stretch stood the ongoing contest with Larry Bird, a rivalry that had begun in that 1979 championship game and continued through finals meetings in 1984 and 1987. Bird was methodical, precise, unhurried in his cruelty toward opposing defenses. Johnson was expansive, kinetic, and warm in a way that made the game look easier than it was. Neither man was ever the villain in the other's story. Both made the other sharper by simply existing on the opposite bench. "Larry Bird is so good, it's frightening," Johnson said of him, without qualification. In Game 4 of the 1987 Finals, with the series tied and the Celtics' defense collapsing toward him, Johnson released a running hook shot over Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish that the broadcast that night called, with real affection, the Junior Skyhook. It fell through. The Lakers won that game and, 4 nights later, the series. What the television cameras could not carry into American living rooms was everything happening far away from that shot. What the cameras missed was the accumulation underneath the highlight. The travel schedule, the film sessions that ran past midnight, the taped ankles before every practice, the standing expectation that the same open expression would greet every camera, every night, for 12 professional seasons. The more he won, the easier it became for the public to forget that the body producing all of it belonged to an ordinary human being operating at an extraordinary pace. Both truths, the glory and its daily cost, belong together, and neither one erases the other. Waiting even further from the cameras was a private life the public knew almost nothing about. Waiting away from the cameras was a private life that deserves the same care given to the championships. Johnson married Erlitha Cookie Kelly on September 14, 1991, in a small ceremony in Lansing, weeks before the world would learn what the couple already knew. Cookie was pregnant at the time with their son. She has spoken publicly, in her own words, about the fear that arrived alongside that diagnosis, and about her decision to remain at her husband's side rather than walk away from the marriage. That decision belongs to her, made with a clarity that deserves to be stated plainly rather than dramatized. Cookie Johnson has tested HIV negative. Their son, Irvin Johnson III, known as EJ, was born on June 4, 1992, and publicly came out as gay in 2013, a fact that belongs to him as a full person rather than as a detail attached to his father's story. Their daughter Elisa was adopted into the family in 1995. Johnson also has a son, Andre, born in 1981 from an earlier relationship with Melissa Mitchell, a relationship that predates the marriage and is acknowledged here without further comment. A championship ring can sit quietly in a drawer for years without causing anyone pain. A family cannot be filed away in the same manner, and it should never be treated as though it could. Weeks after that wedding, the whole country would learn exactly what this family was about to carry together. The most consequential day of Johnson's public life arrived on November 7, 1991. When he stood before reporters at the Great Western Forum and announced that he had tested positive for HIV and that he would retire from the Lakers immediately. It remains among the most watched and culturally significant press conferences in the history of American sport, precisely because so many people watching it live still remember exactly where they were when it happened. In 1991, an HIV diagnosis was widely regarded, in both medical understanding and public imagination, as a near-certain death sentence, and the conference carried that weight in every sentence. Testing itself was still a relatively new part of public health practice. Treatment options were limited, and the disease had already claimed the lives of public figures whose fame had done little to slow its progression. Against that backdrop, a professional athlete at the height of his career announcing his own diagnosis, calmly and in his own words, was an act that had no real precedent in American sport. What that diagnosis actually meant for his body, medically, deserves to be stated with precision rather than fear. HIV is not the same condition as AIDS, and Johnson's decades of continued health rest on a critical distinction the public did not fully grasp at the time. He has managed the virus through consistent antiretroviral therapy and has remained undetectable for years, an outcome made possible by sustained medical care and access that remains, even now, out of reach for millions of people living with HIV around the world. Everyone thought I was going to die like a year later. They didn't know, Johnson later reflected, so I helped educate sports, and then the world, that a man living with HIV can play basketball. In a lighter, more private register, he once described the daily reality of it this way: "It's funny, because the only time I think about HIV is when I have to take my medicine twice a day. The body that had carried a championship career now carried something else as well, and it has carried both, quietly, for more than 30 years. What it did not carry, at least not right away, was a return to the game itself. The formal closing of that era arrived without ceremony. In a season Johnson did not play at all. He returned briefly on February 9, 1992, at the NBA All-Star Game in Orlando, voted onto the floor by fans who had not stopped believing in him. He scored 25 points and was named the game's most valuable player. One more stage was still waiting for him that same year, on the other side of the world. Later that summer in Barcelona, he took the floor for the United States Olympic team known ever since as the Dream Team, alongside Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, and Patrick Ewing, a roster that went undefeated on its way to a gold medal. "Standing on that platform, I said a silent prayer," Johnson said afterward. "I thanked God for giving me the strength and the opportunity to come back, to play basketball again, and to be part of that whole magnificent Olympic experience. It's a memory I will always cherish." Not long after, the sport's next great era arrived in earnest, carried forward by Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls dynasty that would define the 1990s the way Johnson and Bird had defined the 1980s. Neither man is the villain in that transition. Both belong, fully and permanently, to the same history. A ceremony, an all-star vote, a gold medal, all of it carried real respect passed between generations. Beneath that respect sat a truth every great athlete eventually meets. Time reorders even the achievements that once felt permanent, and a record can be surpassed. The life that built it cannot be handed off to anyone else. And the public, for its part, did not always know what to do with the man left standing after the record changed hands. Public understanding of Johnson did not arrive all at once, and it did not arrive kindly at first. In the immediate aftermath of the 1991 announcement, a portion of the public and press questioned whether he deserved sympathy at all, tying the diagnosis to judgments about his personal conduct rather than treating it as the medical event it was. Some of that scrutiny was carried in the language of the era's talk shows and sports columns, where a diagnosis became, for a period, a referendum on a man's private choices rather than a matter of his health. Johnson addressed that scrutiny directly rather than deflecting it. "The real story is that I had unprotected sex," he said. "That's that." He offered no further theater around it, and the plainness of the statement did more to correct the record than any defense could have. But that was not the only thing the public had misjudged about him. A second, quieter misreading had already been forming for a decade before that. The assumption that his warmth and his visible joy on the court signaled a lack of competitive depth, that he was the entertainer standing opposite Jordan's cast as the assassin. The record does not support that reading. Johnson won 5 championships in a career shortened by a diagnosis that arrived when he was 32 years old, in the middle of what should have been several more prime seasons. "I'm at peace with myself," he said, years later. "The main thing is not letting people dictate what I do or what I am." The response to his diagnosis was shaped, inevitably, by the racial and cultural assumptions of the era, and by the specific climate of fear that surrounded the AIDS crisis in America at that time. Many viewers who once questioned him have, in the years since, revised that judgment on their own terms. The world simply took longer to understand this particular person than it should have, and what he built next was, in its own way, an answer to all of it. What came after basketball was not a diminishment of the life that preceded it. Magic Johnson Enterprises became a vehicle for deliberate, targeted investment in Black American communities that had long been overlooked by conventional business models. Starbucks franchises placed in neighborhoods that corporate expansion routinely skipped. Movie theaters built where none had existed. Real estate development aimed at underserved commercial corridors. It was a business philosophy built on the same instinct that had once guided a no-look pass: identify where value was being overlooked and deliver it directly rather than waiting for someone else to notice first. "I tell people to look at me and understand that everybody first told me that I couldn't be a 6-foot 9-inch point guard, and I proved them wrong," Johnson said of that chapter. "Then they told me I couldn't be a businessman and make money in urban America, and I proved them wrong." The list of what came next only grew longer from there. In 2012, he joined an ownership group that purchased the Los Angeles Dodgers for $2.15 billion. the largest sum ever paid for a Major League Baseball franchise at that time, and he later became an owner of the Los Angeles Sparks of the 1BA. From 2017 to 2019, he served as president of basketball operations for the Los Angeles Lakers, resigning unexpectedly in April of 2019 before that season had concluded. A decision he has discussed publicly and without pretense. He was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame in 2002 and into the FIBA Hall of Fame in 2015. Through the Magic Johnson Foundation, he has spent decades funding HIV and AIDS education and community health services, a mission he has described in plainly spiritual terms. "I enjoy being the messenger for God," he said, in terms of letting people know about HIV and AIDS. The same discipline that once built a fast break now builds a balance sheet and a foundation's mission statement, applied to a different court entirely. What remains, after all of it, is the question every life like this one eventually asks. He was the most openly joyful player in the history of American professional basketball, and on November 7, 1991, he faced the most privately devastating public moment any athlete of his era would ever have to face. Both of those sentences are true at once, and neither one cancels the other. The achievements stand on their own and need no inflation. 5 NBA championships, 3 MVP awards, 3 Finals MVP honors, 12 All-Star selections, an Olympic gold medal earned twice over, once in the achievement of making the team at all, and once in Barcelona itself, a place among the 50 greatest players in NBA history, and 2 halls of fame that bear his name. None of that list, however complete, captures the one thing that mattered most on the day it counted. Not athletic courage, which basketball had already tested and confirmed many times over. Human courage, the willingness to stand in front of a world that had not yet decided what it believed about HIV, and to tell that world the truth in a clear, calm, and generous voice, at the exact moment when silence would have been so much easier to choose. That courage did not end when the press conference did. A jersey can hang from the rafters of an arena without feeling any of the strain that earned its place there. The man who wore it does not have that option. He carries the accumulated seasons home with him, in the joints and in the memory both, long after the banner has stopped moving. Return for a moment to Lansing, Michigan, and to a boy on the courts of Middle Street, already making the people around him better before he had any language for what he was doing. Magic Johnson gave basketball more than statistics. He gave it his trust, his joy, his years, and finally his most private truth, offered publicly at the one moment when almost anyone else would have chosen to disappear instead. When the court no longer calls a man's name, what remains is never a trophy. It is the shape of a person who carried greatness and its cost in the very same open hands. The ball no longer has to move for him the way it once did. It rests quietly now, somewhere between memory and museum. But its echo is still alive in Los Angeles, and in Lansing, and in every patient who heard his voice in 1991 and understood, for the first time, that they were not alone, and in every player since who learned that the highest form of greatness is making the people around you larger than they were before you arrived. If Magic Johnson was part of your understanding of what it means to play with joy, to lead with trust, and to face the unthinkable with grace, consider leaving a tribute below, not only for the 5 championships, or for the no-look pass that changed how the position was played, for the press conference, for Cookie, for everything he gave beyond the boundaries of the court itself. A like and a subscription would honor his story well, and there are more stories of this depth still to tell, about other American figures whose deepest courage was found far from the spotlight that first made them famous.